Every bit as sickening, the words of the British Prime Minister Theresa May after a man drove a van at high speed hitting Muslim worshippers in London. What's behind the rise in these types of attacks and how will it impact Britain's diverse society? This is Inside Story. Welcome to the programme. I'm Sohail Rahman. It's become an all too common trend, attackers driving vans into crowded streets. This time, the victims were all Muslim as they left the Finsbury Park Mosque in London after midnight prayers. Now, it happened during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. At least one person has died, 11 others are injured. Bystanders tackled and held a 48-year-old attacker as he tried to leave the van. Police now have him in custody. Prime Minister Theresa May says police declared this a terrorist attack within 8 minutes and that counter-terrorism police are now investigating.
This was an attack on Muslims near their place of worship. And like all terrorism, in whatever form, it shares the same fundamental goal. It seeks to drive us apart and to break the precious bonds of solidarity and citizenship that we share in this country. We will not let this happen. As I said here 2 weeks ago, there has been far too much tolerance of extremism in our country over many years, and that means extremism of any kind, including Islamophobia.
Now, London Mayor Sadiq Khan also spoke about the attack on Monday. Here's what he had to say.
I want to pay tribute to the fantastic response from the police and emergency services, but also from the local community. The local worshippers apprehended the man in the van who mowed down the pedestrians. I've heard stories from the imam who stopped local residents from understandably taking out their anger on this terrorist.
Well, it's been a tumultuous few months for people living in the United Kingdom. On March the 22nd, Khalid Masood drove a van at high speed, hitting pedestrians on Westminster Bridge in London. He also stabbed people in the area. 5 were killed. Exactly 2 months later, there was a suicide attack at the Ariana Grande concert in Manchester. 22 people were killed, many of them young girls. And on June the 3rd, there were coordinated attacks on London Bridge and at Borough Market. The attackers used a van, knives and guns. 8 people were killed. Well, let's bring in our guest for this edition of Inside Story. In London, we have Azad Ali. He's Head of Community Development for Muslim Engagement and Development Organisation. In Bristol, Aurélien Mondon, he's lecturer at the University of Bath. He's a specialist on racism, populism and far-right movements. And also in London, Afzal Ashraf, security and counter-terrorism specialist. Gentlemen, welcome to this edition of Inside Story. Azad Ali, can I begin with you in London? You've just come from Finsbury Park. Just give us an idea of the mood of the community and the atmosphere there at the moment.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I think the mood can be captured in one word, shock and togetherness. I think that's what you can add to that. The community is actually in shock that this incident can take place. That you know, it is absolutely horrifying. There's a lot of people grieving. There's a lot of emotion. But you know, the thing that stood out the most is that people are together. You know, there is a real sense of community, solidarity, and togetherness, and I think that's really coming through. And I think it exemplifies what a lot of people have been feeling about the rise in Islamophobia, that, you know, we are, as a community, are suffering a huge increase in Islamophobic hate crimes.
We'll get into that. We'll get into that into more depth. It's just getting that. Sorry, Azad. We'll get into that into more depth as the programme develops. Just wanted to get an idea of the mood. Let me bring in Aurélien Mondon in Bristol. Of course, it is a sense of community, a sense of grief that we've seen in Manchester and in the community of Borough and Westminster and London Bridge when those attacks happened as well. There is that sense of grief and community togetherness. But really, let's get to the nitty-gritty of the methodology about what individuals are doing in the name of a religion or an ideological political stance. And what happened on Seven Sisters Road will be revealed in the coming days as the police continue their inquiries. But can you just define for us what actually constitutes an act of terror and what constitutes a hate crime, or are they just one and the same?
Well, they're not necessarily one and the same, but the act of terror here is really to kind of bring fear into a community, and really the way this took place was really targeting certain individuals for their faith to make a clear statement, to send a clear signal to these people. And of course, we will have to wait and see who the attacker was exactly, and whether he has said any more, and what he will say when he's interrogated by the police about his motives. But there is a clear sign of terrorism here, and it is also a hate crime, because again it is clearly hatred towards a certain population, towards a certain minority which has been suffering from hate crime. But hate crime doesn't have to be terrorism, and vice versa.
Afzal Ashraf, let me bring you in here. Would you agree then with the Prime Minister's quote that this was in fact an act of terrorism, a correct definition by the Prime Minister, done very quickly?
Yes, I think it is obviously an act of terrorism. I'm afraid if we start getting into definitions even of terrorism, you could be here all day. The same thing with hate crime. The fact is, terrorism does require hatred for it to be effective. So we really don't want to get into definitions. The point is, this was an act of terrorism intended to mimic, possibly to act as a reprisal for what the perpetrators believed to be acts of terrorism in London Bridge and Westminster Bridge earlier this year. So it is terrorism in every sense of the word.
How do you, Aurélien Mondon, can I just bring you back in here in Bristol? The issue of how the authorities now have to deal with individuals, lone wolves, and these sorts of attacks. We've seen them in France and Germany over the past couple of years. Now we're seeing them, unfortunately, with more prevalence in the UK in the last couple of months. It is a real worry for the authorities. Is there any train of thought across Europe as to how to deal with this at the moment?
Well, I think first we have to be careful with the term lone wolf. I mean, these people might be acting on their own, but their political behavior and their political ideas do not happen in a vacuum. These people are usually well connected on online forums or with other people on the ground. So it's not because they're acting on their own, but they're acting in a political vacuum. I think what will need to be done, of course, is a thorough investigation to see whether this man has accomplices or not. But beyond that, I think what will need to take place is a real, if Theresa May is serious about countering extremism in this country, what will have to be done is to counter extremism and Islamophobia in all its forms, which is, of course, the terrible attacks like the one that took place yesterday, or the acts of hate crimes which are found out on a daily basis, but also what's taking place in our mainstream media, for example, and the front page of some newspapers, which might help justify some people's actions in their mind. Of course, I'm not saying that newspapers are responsible for what's taking place, but when you see certain front pages, it is clearly legitimizing some kind of hatred towards certain communities, and this is very, very problematic in a country and in a democracy.
Indeed, and I'm certainly not trying to be a sensationalist in any way, just using the terminology that we've seen used by, you might say, the press, the media, even politicians. But let's just take a little pause. I want to just bring our viewers up to speed with what else has been happening as well, because we heard just earlier that the London Mayor Sadiq Khan had what he had to say really about what had happened at Seven Sisters Road. In that same press conference, the Mayor also spoke about hate crimes in London. Let's just listen to what he had to say.
There will be a zero tolerance towards hate crime. And my message to anyone who's the victim of hate crime is please report it to the police. Don't think it's too trivial. Don't think the police will take action. They will.
Indeed, according to London Police, hate crimes are physical assaults, verbal abuse or threats specifically targeted at a person because of their gender, race, religion or any other perceived difference. There were 54 racist incidents 2 days after the London Bridge attack compared to the daily average of 38 for the year. That's a 40% increase according to the figures released by London's mayor. And 20 of the crimes specifically had anti-Muslim motives compared to the average of under 4. Now, we've seen this before. After the Brexit vote, hate crimes in the UK also increased, but they were against minorities in general. And after the recent attacks in Manchester and London, the attacks have been more targeted against people assumed to be Muslims. Let's just bring you back in, Azad Ali. How divisive is or was this issue in terms of the conversation that was being had in communities that you interact with about racial hatred or even incidents of racial attacks, whether they be verbal or physical?
Yeah, Islamophobia, I think, is what we need to call it. The form of hate crime we're talking about is Islamophobia. And for the last 4 or 5 years, we've been talking about it and how it's actually very organized and it's actually increasing and getting to the point where it has dehumanized a lot of the Muslim population to the point where the level of hate that is kind of projected towards them is getting worse. And I think, you know, this is a proof in case. And just to go back to what the earlier professor mentioned from Bristol about newspapers and everything else, you know, we really have to ask a serious question, and the government, if it's serious, has to follow Lord Leveson's recommendation on the Leveson inquiry about how media is dealing with some of the headlines and how it behaves in terms of complaints and responses. We need an independent regulator. You know, the way the Daily Mail online yesterday covered the story about the attack outside Finsbury Park Mosque, it kind of demonized the mosque in a way which almost made a lot of the viewers, a lot of the people that saw it, seem like they were justifying that this attack was justified because a certain preacher used to go to that mosque or be at that mosque. And I think this is a very important thing to challenge. Islamophobia has now reached the point where it's become normalized. And I think, you know, we in the community, we are looking for proper answers. You know, it's tragic and it's unbelievable that even today we don't have a national strategy.
Let's bounce what you're saying. Let's bounce what you're saying, Azad, with our other guests as well. They would like to contribute to what you're saying. Early on in Bristol, can I bring you in here? I mean, is it really the government's responsibility and totally the government's responsibility to actually find solutions? You know, solutions come from the grassroots level more often than not, and it's as much of a responsibility for communities as a whole, for local politicians, for aid workers, as well as the lawmakers themselves.
Well, I think you can see the reactions from the grassroots movements, and I think you can see you can see some very positive reactions on the ground to all the tragedies that have happened in the UK. I mean, if you look at the terrorist attacks in the past few months, you know, people have been opening their doors to other people so that they can find a safe haven. If you look at what happened after Grenfell, after the fire, you know, you can see again that a lot of people have been contributing, have been helping, and no matter what their community was, in a way, people, you know, turned to each other, and we had a real community feeling. I think there's a responsibility from our elite here, from our elite being politicians, being the media and so on, who have been playing in this essentialization of communities for quite a few years now and normalizing racist discourses, not just Islamophobia, by the way, but many other racist discourses, by creating various communities and by essentializing them, by giving these communities certain inalienable traits. Therefore, when we see a terrorist attack that's committed in the name of Islam, everyone, not everyone, but a lot of the media tends to jump to conclusions and asking for, you know, all Muslim people to apologize or to kind of come back on it, and as if they were owning it, as if it was their community, even though they have nothing to do with these attackers. And I think, again, the responsibility here, we can see the grassroots movements trying to help each other. We could see it today and yesterday when all the different communities, all the different religious communities came together to denounce these actions again. But what we don't see at the moment is real political courage at the top level. And we don't see any responsibility on the part of some of the media in this country to avoid jumping to conclusion and to take their time before they actually comment on stories that are quite blurry and would require nuance and a clear head and a cold head.
And indeed, certainly with what's happened in Seven Sisters, there's still a lot of questions to be answered. Afzal Ashraf, you have a unique position, or you have had a unique position in the past, of working very closely with the police on issues of race hate and how to deal with it. When you hear the Prime Minister's statements that she's going to put more police or more security services into this sphere of protection of the British public, regardless of their race, gender or religious beliefs, what is the reaction of the police? What is the response from these, you might say, shifting sands?
I think the police have, for many years, taken this issue seriously. I've worked with a lot of senior policemen, and they are, without exception, in my experience, very concerned and are doing everything they can to build bridges, and they have successfully built bridges in many instances. There are, of course, exceptions. The problem, I think, is that this issue goes beyond the issue of local terrorism. It is linked with wider geopolitical factors where terrorism has been used for centuries by all states to further wider geopolitical issues. And the problem is that in the past, the failures were contained regionally elsewhere. Now the failures or the effects are coming home to roost. So what the politicians have to do is to take leadership. As Aryan said, there has to be political leadership and not follow bias and distorted reporting from whatever politically biased media there is. They have to address the problem of security in a wider sense and not just throw police and other security agencies at it. It cannot continue because in the past the security services were able to detect plots through the making of bombs and bullets. Now these plots are probably thought of in the morning and executed in the afternoon or the evening without the need to plan, without the need to acquire weapons or to communicate. All of those things that the intelligence services and police needed to be able to detect and disrupt the plot. So now we're going into a very new domain where the politicians have to do something different from just throwing more manpower at the problem. They've got to solve the problem at the grassroots.
Okay, Asad Ali, you seem to want to come in there.
Yeah, I mean, two things. I think it's what Ashraf just mentioned is very important, is that we mustn't be led into this issue and resolving this issue by the media. And I think a lot of the time the responses from the government has been media driven, and we've got to really park this aside. It needs to come from bottom up. As the guest from Bristol mentioned, you know, civil society, community organisations have been there at the forefront dealing with issues. And you know, we see this time and time again. Even if you look at a different issue, the Grenfell Tower fire, you see how the community responded. So the community response is there. What we need is an honest conversation from the government to discuss with the different communities, including the Muslim communities, organizations like ourselves and others that are working in this area for many, many years, sit around the table and address the issue. Our number one kind of concern for the government, for them to take on board, is that they need a proper national strategy on Islamophobia. One does not exist. It's shocking that not many councils across this country have actually a policy on Islamophobia. I was in Peterborough yesterday just talking about this, and the police there aren't even sure if they should be recording Islamophobia, even though this is part of their requirement. This is where we are, and I think it's shocking.
If that's the case,
I think the community is feeling a little bit frustrated about this.
If that's the case, let me just bring in Aurélien Mondon again from Bristol about, you know, at what stage do the authorities actually start doing something? I mean, historically, when would you say the turning point was where Muslims in a predominantly white society were looked on suspiciously? I mean, was it September the 11th? Was it 7/7? Was it the North of England riots in 2001 where we saw areas such as Oldham and Bradford on fire? Or was it even before that in Toxteth in Liverpool in 1981, which was a different sort of race riot as well, but mainly focusing on the inequalities people felt there about their lives and the situations they were living in, and nobody in government or local politics was listening to them?
Well, I mean, racism is nothing new, of course, but racism is something that evolves, and Islamophobia is something that has evolved and that has become particularly and very sadly and tragically fashionable, mostly after 9/11, which I think was a turning point. It doesn't mean that it didn't exist before, but it came under different kind of forms. I think Islamophobia has allowed many far-right parties, many racist theorists across the West, not just in the UK, to actually come back with the same good old racist ideas, except instead of having them in more kind of biological traditional racism forms, they've changed them and say, well, you know, look, we're not racist, Islam is not a race, it's a religion and so on. But at the end of the day, it's exactly the same form of racism, because these racists turn Islam and Muslims into a race by giving them inalienable characteristics. So because people are Muslim, they seem to be seen as sexist, as backwards, and so on and so forth. And it's exactly the same as the good old racism. So we need to be careful here, again, not to kind of call Islamophobia anything but racism. Islamophobia is racism,
but we recently
and it is something that has become very common after 9/11.
In the last year, in the last year early on, we've seen elections in Austria, in the Netherlands, and in France, and a lot of the platforms that some of those political parties stood on was an issue of being anti-Islam, and the whole issue of Islamophobia centred on their policies. It was rejected at the ballot box. It hasn't got that far here in the UK. I don't think it certainly wasn't an election issue in the recent vote.
I think these issues, though, are part of a bigger picture of a return of racism into the mainstream in many ways. And you can see it in the UK as well, maybe not so much in terms of Islamophobia, but you could see it during the Brexit debate, which was very much about creating identities and creating essentialized identities where people belonged or did not belong, and minorities belonged or did not belong, and minorities ended up suffering the brunt of this anti-minority sentiment. And also something that's quite important about Islamophobia and the way to tackle Islamophobia is that you gave us figures earlier on. But, you know, these figures are probably way below what actually is taking place on a daily basis, because people do not tend to report Islamophobic attacks, for example, because, as we heard from one of your guests, some of the police doesn't know how to respond to these yet. So I think we do need to think very carefully about what's taking place on the ground, but also at the level of elite discourse, and what is legitimizing these attacks on the streets.
Afzal Ashraf, you wanted to come in there.
Yeah, I think that what we're talking about, and all that's been said, is very sensible, but it's a symptom of the problem. The reason we have the rise of right-wing extremist organizations in Europe is primarily driven by immigration, which is very largely in turn driven by political and economic refugees, or the increase of political and economic refugees in recent years, caused by wars, caused by political instability, that has been in turn caused by a system of international relations which is way past its sell-by date. I don't want to get into the ethics of it. We can always debate the ethics. The point is, it no longer works. And so the big players in the world have got to stop thinking that they can go around changing the geography, the political geography of the world, and assume that their failures, and there used to be failures when they did regime change in the Middle East and elsewhere, the consequences of the failures remained in the region. Now they're coming home to roost in the form of communities, immigrant, refugee communities. They're coming home in the form of terrorism, and it needs a wider geopolitical look at this. Otherwise, you'll get very good people trying their best at community levels to put the fires out, working out ways of better cooperation with the police, better relationships, and they will make a difference, but not enough.
OK, we're just coming very close to the end of the programme, so I just want some very quick quotes on really the PM's now statement saying there's no place for this type of hate or Islamophobia, and she wants to focus her intent on dealing with social media and safe areas in the internet. We are short for time. Azad Ali, what's your opinion of what she had to say?
Yeah, no, I think it is positive. I think it's late, but I'm glad it's there. I think online is an area we need to deal with, but we also need to deal with organizations that peddle hate and also media that is allowing a lot of the hate to take place, in particular against the Muslim community. So I think my big request to the Prime Minister is, implement the Leveson Part 2 and let's have an independent press complaints commission.
Well, let's see what does happen in the coming days. Unfortunately there, gentlemen, we have to leave it for this edition of Inside Story. It's been good to have you with us, Azad Ali, Orlean Mondon and Afzal Ashraf. Thank you all for joining me from both Bristol and London. And of course, you can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Sohail Rahman. Until next time, and the whole team, do take care. Bye-bye.